for now, without much ado, I'll hand it over to Mary and Zoya. So both of them are prolific people with a very different experience, young as well as very detailed experience, both of them in the whistleblower space. Um, Over to you, Mary.
Thank you so much, Sean. It's a pleasure to be here today and to celebrate Sushir's legacy and hopefully bring about some change as a result of the unfortunate event. So Zoya and I were each going to give a short presentation and then engage in a bit of a discussion between the two of us, and then hopefully take your questions. So Zoya, why don't we start with you, and if you could introduce yourself as well. Oh, I don't think we're hearing you.
Is that better?
Yes, we can
Can
hear
you hear
you
me now?
Yes.
Amazing. Perfect. Let me just share my screen. If I do that, can everyone see me? See the slides?
Yes, Zoya.
Okay, amazing. Yeah, hello everyone. Thank you here for having me here to honor Sushir's legacy and also advance meaningful reforms in AI transparency and accountability. My name is Zoya Yasmine. I'm a researcher in the medical AI industry, but I'm also a PhD student in the Faculty of Law at the University of Oxford, where my research does touch upon whistleblowing laws in the AI industry. I'm also an associate member of Whistleblowers UK. Alongside Mary, we'll be chatting to you today about the cost of the truth, developing upon Pav's great talk that was just shared, and how the significant costs that whistleblowers bore are enabled by our flawed legal system. I'll be specifically looking at the UK context, and the amazing Mary will be covering the US context in more detail. As mentioned, we'll then have a short discussion about each other's presentation and potentially what the UK and US can learn from one another. And following that, if we have time, we'll open up the opportunity for any questions from any of you. So I'm sure I'll be preaching to the choir by saying that AI is increasingly being integrated into society. We've gone from having the technology embedded in our phones on predicted text to AI technologies being used to make really fundamental decisions about us and for us, which impact our relationships, our livelihoods, our human rights, and our health. These are just a few screen grabs that I've got that show the impacts of AI that are happening. So obviously, OpenAI's use of copyright protected training data. On the other side, Meta knowing that its algorithm was making teenage girls' mental health worse, and also Google planning to build a censored search engine for the Chinese market. And in light of these, the increased rollout of AI in society, we would also expect there to be greater auditing and transparency so we can understand how these decisions are being made and how we can hold these companies accountable when things go wrong. However, we've witnessed the complete opposite. The industry is resisting oversight and increasingly operating under a veil of secrecy. As a result, we've been thinking about how we can better hold these companies accountable and increase transparency so we know what the risks and harms of AI are. And this memorial conference today is a great example of that. And there's been a few approaches to increasing AI transparency, such as mandating AI model cards and disclosures of summaries of training datasets. However, these traditional approaches to AI transparency enable us to see, but not necessarily know. And this idea is from a research paper by Anay and Crawford about the flaws of traditional approaches to AI transparency. And what I mean between seeing and knowing, and the gap between seeing and knowing is quite significant, because if we rely on these traditional approaches to AI transparency, we make a lot of assumptions about what transparency can do. So firstly, transparency doesn't equal accountability. We've assumed that if tech companies are transparent about what they're doing, we'll be able to hold them to account. But I think the big copyright debate is a really good example of the fact that we know, and these companies have been open about the fact that they're training their models on copyright protected materials. But in the UK, we're struggling to hold these companies accountable because we don't necessarily have the power or the necessarily legal frameworks to prevent them and stop them from doing so. Secondly, we shouldn't privilege seeing over understanding, and being able to look inside systems will not always allow us to determine how technology will operate in the real world. The real world is messy, and how code or data sets look in the abstract will not necessarily be able to enable us to know how these systems work when they're connected to other AI models or used for different purposes. And thirdly, one can be transparent about something, but that doesn't necessarily mean it'll be the truth. And that there's increasing evidence of AI companies who are complicit in ethics washing practices. And these can, in fact, be more harmful since we become less critical in the face of reassurance. And finally, these AI transparency mechanisms are often static. So if I release a piece of code one day, it could change the next or be used for a different purpose. So full transparency at one moment doesn't necessarily extrapolate to different context, times, and environments. So back to the examples that I gave at the beginning of the presentation, we've been missing that traditional transparency approaches miss the role of whistleblowers, who actually bridge the gap between seeing and knowing. Whistleblowers have been shown to testify in court and bring evidence to hold companies accountable. Whistleblowers, while we're dealing with black box AI systems, many whistleblowers who have actually built these systems are best placed to know the risks of these systems and also know what we don't know and communicate that to the public. Whistleblowers also can cut through the false narratives presented by AI companies by kind of comparing what's happening inside to their external messaging. And finally, whistleblowers act as more permanent watchdogs within these companies. They're there when management changes, when decisions, and when different AI models are being used for different purposes, which can change their risk profile. Back to the examples given at the start of the presentation, amidst the industry of secrecy and increasing power of tech companies, we know about all of these risks because of unauthorized disclosures of information from insiders in technology companies who have been able to kind of warn us and spoke out and provided evidence about the harmful developments of AI by their employers. And particularly in this presentation, what I want to draw upon is that despite the role that whistleblowers play in bridging the gap between seeing and knowing, so basically acting as kind of surrogate regulators, the cost of speaking up has legal, psychological, financial, and professional consequences, which are all enabled by our legal frameworks, especially in the UK. There doesn't exactly exist any whistleblowing specific laws in the UK, but there are some protections that we have within employment legislation under the Public Interest Disclosure Act 1998, also known as PIDA. But ultimately, this legislation fails, and specifically in the AI industry. And there's loads of evidence of the kind of failures of the of PIDA because of the structure of the law. But secondly, also, and I'm going to touch upon this in this presentation, but the nature of AI harms renders this legal framework particularly less useful. So firstly, talking about how the law kind of fails to kind of protect whistleblowers, I want to talk about the widespread use of non-disclosure agreements, NDAs, in technology companies. And these are used to silence whistleblowers when they want to speak up and raise concerns about misconduct happening within companies. One New York Times article nicely sums this up as the tech industry's obsession with secrets and their tendency to throw NDAs around like confetti. Now, the issue is that most of these NDAs that are issued can often be actually unenforceable. In the UK, Section 43J of the Employment Rights Act, so under PETA, states that any term in a contract like an NDA is void so far in it prevents a protected disclosure. So this could be a violation of health and safety, a crime, or damage to the environment. But the issue is that most whistleblowers don't know that this clause exists. In fact, a recent investigation by Protect found that 52% of British adults were unaware that legal protection for whistleblowers existed. And employers rarely clarify that NDAs cannot prevent protected disclosures. And specifically now for AI, whistleblowers, navigating this legislation is really, really hard. To qualify to kind of render an NDA as unenforceable, whistleblowers must reasonably believe that their disclosure has been made in relation to those established categories. Now, understanding whether a certain development of AI is a criminal offense or a breach of a legal obligation or a danger to health or safety is really, really difficult when AI harms often involve long-term diffuse risks, which may not obviously fall within these categories. And it's especially an issue when we have less clarity as opposed to kind of the finance industry where the boundaries between like unethical and illegal and unlawful conduct are clearer. In the AI industry, it's difficult to kind of determine when there's no immediate legal violation. Furthermore, AI systems are often black box or protected by trade secrets, making it hard for whistleblowers to obtain or disclose concrete evidence of harms, especially when they're more systemic or abstract. Secondly, following whistleblowing, employees are often fired. While PETA makes retaliation unlawful, the burden of proof is often on whistleblowers to show that the detrimental treatment that they suffered was linked to the disclosure. And tech companies can often use performance-related justifications to mask dismissals made in retaliation. Now also, PETA is also rooted in employment protection, so it only applies to workers. Now, this is obviously so important as AI whistleblowers can be researchers or employees within these companies. But PETA doesn't protect other wider groups such as volunteers or non-employee insiders who may wish to speak out. And I think we need to, especially in the AI industry, understand that ethical obligations to speak out about unsafe AI developments are not only just an employment issue. Also, there are no criminal penalties or really regulatory sanctions for organizations that fail to address risks raised through whistleblowing. This really limits the effect and impact of what the law can do, especially when powerful technology companies with deep resources can pay off whistleblowers, remove them from companies, and continue their unethical practices, rarely without any consequences. And then on a broader level, the general complexity of PETA. Now, I'm a researcher doing a PhD in law, and I found PETA extremely difficult to navigate. The complexity of it basically means that you always need a lawyer, and this is legislation that's been drafted to protect vulnerable employees. Research into the UK's employment tribunal shows that over 1/5 of whistleblowing cases take over 5 years to resolve, and only, I think it's less than 3% of cases have a successful hearing. So only a small amount of whistleblowers, so this whistleblowing protection is not being protective at all. And even when it does, the compensation received from the tribunal rarely covers the legal fees, the time, the physical strain and resources that were required to win that case. And finally, following whistleblowing, employees often find it extremely difficult to find employment in the AI industry after they're dismissed. While PETA makes retaliation unlawful, it's really, really difficult for whistleblowers to show that they've been retaliated against. And other technology companies often view whistleblowers as a threat, and that they might expose or dissent to their unethical AI practices. The tech industry is obviously very networked with strong informal ties, and whistleblowers risk being blacklisted or excluded from future work. Now, given the challenges and inadequacies of these whistleblowing protections in the UK, we're seeing some legislative action to enhance protections for whistleblowers. And one timely intervention concerns the newly enacted Employment Rights Bill, which is passing into UK law. And clause 202A basically states that if an NDA or confidentiality clause stops a worker from speaking out about harassment or discrimination, or how an employer might have handled these, the clause is void, and this also applies to witnesses that have seen this. And whilst this is, the Employment Rights Bill is a step in the right direction, and especially in recognizing witnesses as well, this only covers some of the AI tech-specific whistleblowing cases that are about discrimination. NDAs that silence whistleblowers from speaking out about harmful developments of an AI system would not necessarily be covered by this clause. In addition, the Office of the Whistleblower Bill has been put forward in UK Parliament, and this aims to fill the gaps of the Employment Rights Bill. The office is proposed an independent statutory body that protects whistleblowers and whistleblowing. And just to quickly jump into a little bit deeper into the UK Office of the Whistleblower, because I think this is useful to compare to the US. If properly designed and empowered, it could mitigate the legal drivers that are currently increasing the cost of speaking up in tech and AI contexts. And there's three main ways that I want to draw upon that I think will do this. So firstly, the office will audit and scrutinize organizations' whistleblowing practices, and it will investigate reports of whistleblower retaliation and failures to act on disclosed risks, and also recommend fines in cases where they failed to act. And then I think this is really important because it shifts the burden from the individual to more of a systemic accountability enforced by the office. Secondly, the office creates a single kind of one-stop shop for whistleblowers, which I think in the AI industry is very important, where we have complex cross-sector tech issues. So whistleblowers wouldn't need to determine whether which regulator they could make a protected disclosure to, for example, the Information Commissioner's Office or the medical regulators or Ofcom. The office could kind of triage and forward disclosures to the correct bodies, or investigate them themselves if none of them had a remit. And thirdly, I think this is really important in this space and not spoken about enough. But whistleblowing usually currently in the UK is dealt with on a case-by-case basis, often privately in employment tribunals or behind closed doors in settlements. And this means that patterns of unethical or dangerous behavior across tech companies can go undetected. The office will report and track systemic failures disclosed by and categorize these by organization, by sector, by type of misconduct and outcome. And then in doing so, the office can share insights with regulators and create alerts for repeated allegations against the same company, or highlight systemic weaknesses in industries. The Office of the Whistleblower Bill is not law. It's been repeatedly introduced in Parliament, most recently. But the UK government has delayed its second reading until basically 2026, effectively shelving it during a time of accelerating tech risk and corporate secrecy. In a field like AI, 2 years is honestly a lifetime. By 2026, unregulated systems may already be deployed in policing, healthcare, finance, and warfare without adequate mechanisms to protect and warn us about these unanticipated harms. So just to finish off this presentation, in short, I was asked here to speak about the cost of the truth, specifically from a UK context. And I respond by saying that the cost of the truth is multifaceted in whistleblowing for whistleblowers, and it leads to isolation, retaliation, blacklisting, and silencing. All of these, I'm sure, of which will be covered in more depth in later talks today. But what I wanted to highlight was that these are all enabled by the law. And the law is something that often people turn to when they're vulnerable for protection, but it seems to obviously be failing. It doesn't have to be this way. The Office of the Whistleblower and the Employment Rights Bill show how we can change the culture, and these are both provide opportunities to step in when warnings about unethical and unlawful commercial conduct could never be more important. So unless we change the law and unless we build a legal system that makes truth less costly, we'll continue to let AI harms pursue in the shadow of the law. So it's time, I think, that we started protecting those who speak up about AI harms, who are protecting us in the public interest. So if you're in the UK or even further afield, consider supporting these legislative bills. The Employment Rights Bill's gone through Parliament and will become law, but the Office of the Whistleblower needs more support to enable it, and you can draw upon it in your own jurisdictions to advocate for whistleblower protections that you think are necessary. Thank you so much. I'm going to hand over to Mary.
Thank you so much, Zoya. It was a great presentation. I'm going to pick up on the themes that you have and share my slides. Just a second.
Okay, so yeah, you're done. Awesome. It was a great presentation, Zoya. Are you able to hear me?
Thank you. Yeah, thank you.
Good, awesome. Now I think I can open up the floor to both you and Mary. Mary, please feel free. It was a great, insightful presentation of Zoya. Now I'll hand it over to you.
Yes, I'm just trying to share my screen if you'll give me a moment.
Sure.
Okay. All right.
We see your desktop, Mary.
Bringing down my slides here.
Sure. Awesome.
Okay, here we go. All right, can you see my slides?
I think it's in some presentation mode. Okay.
Yeah, hold on. This is the wrong mode. Give me one more chance here.
Sure, take your time.
Let's try screen 2. I have too many screens, Sean.
No problem. So I think this is perfect.
Let's see if I can get to the right slide.
I
Okay, that should do it, yes?
Okay, give me a minute. I think everybody should be seeing your presentation now. Okay, cool. All set.
Great. So meanwhile, zooming to the other side of the pond from the UK, I wanted to talk also about the same topic, the human costs of blowing the whistleblower in the AI space. Wanted to just briefly introduce myself so you can have a sense for the perspective that I bring to this topic. I have spent the past 30 years representing whistleblowers under what are known in the US as the US Whistleblower Reward Programs. I am not an employment attorney, so I don't handle whistleblower retaliation claims. What I do is act more like a matchmaker, where I pair whistleblowers with, as confidential informants, whistleblowers who have typically inside information. I pair them with the various government agencies who seek to act on that information. And if they use the whistleblower's information, typically pay them a financial incentive, a percentage of any fine imposed. We will talk in a minute with Zoya about the UK starting to adopt some of these reward programs. And that is hopefully some of the more positive developments. We're going to talk a lot about the costs of whistleblowing, but it is a risk reward calculus. And there are some positive things that we'll want to draw into the positive impacts of whistleblowing. But first, to stay with the risks, the costs, I wanted to ground us in some research. There's a very famous New England Journal of Medicine article, a study from 2010 that looked at pharmaceutical whistleblowers and their experience, basically the health impacts. And this study concluded that whistleblowers had higher incidences of divorce, substance abuse, depression, sort of chronicling the physical manifestations of whistleblowing. I'm pleased that 3 of my whistleblower clients were featured in this article from 2019 on the personal toll of whistleblowing. I highly recommend the article to you, and it really chronicles the experience of 3 healthcare fraud whistleblowers that I represented who were working with the DOJ in successful cases alleging Medicare fraud. And the themes that we saw are ones that have become sadly increasingly familiar for us, largely coming out of the Me Too movement. I think people became more familiar with the concept of gaslighting. Whistleblowers are frequently gaslit. They're made to feel like they're the only one who thinks they're a problem. When they blow the whistle, unfortunately, it seems to be a bit of a corporate playbook, regardless of industry, that employers get medieval and tend to shoot the messenger rather than paying attention to the whistleblower's message. That can be very disorienting, of course, for a whistleblower. As you can imagine, they bring this information forward. It may just be a requirement of their job. They don't even think that they're whistleblowing. And often it's the companies themselves that turn whistleblowers into whistleblowers by treating them as the problem rather than looking at the problem they're trying to highlight. Ironically, the term whistleblower has many origins. In the US, it was on the production line. You blew the whistle to stop production when there was a problem. In the UK, I had heard it had been for calling a bobby whistle, a police officer, blowing the whistle to bring attention over to the misconduct. It's never about the police officer, right? But somehow that is what we do in whistleblowing, is to shoot the messenger, to make it about the person raising the concern, not about the actual concern itself. So that can have really serious psychosocial and health impacts on people when they're not believed, when they're made to be the problem. They are often perceived as radioactive, contagious, which causes them to lose the support of their coworkers, or worried that if they are close to that whistleblower, they may also suffer the effects of retaliation. So it can be a very lonely, isolating experience. And that's not to mention the other effects that retaliation and other forms that retaliation can take, including blacklisting, not just being fired or retaliated against in your job, but in future jobs as well if the word gets out. So can have very serious repercussions. I know Jackie Garrick from Whistleblowers of America will be talking later today in more depth about the psychosocial impacts, and I really commend her to you. So it can be an incredibly lonely journey, and it really highlights sort of the importance of creating support systems for whistleblowers early on, and new ways to even imagine the act of whistleblowing. We'll talk in a minute about a movement afoot, including in AI, where we've already seen collectives of whistleblowers speaking up, and that providing safety and strength in numbers. So we'll talk about that in a moment. We haven't talked in terms of costs yet today about the societal costs of sidelining and retaliating against whistleblowers. I wanted to highlight a very prominent UK whistleblower who blew the whistle on the National Health Service. One of the world's leading cardiologists, a gentleman by the name of Dr. Raj Mattu. And I list him as an example of some of the societal costs, because by blacklisting whistleblowers, it doesn't just hurt them, it harms society. You think about the cost to the public and to the health of folks in the UK, that this incredible doctor has not worked in this field since then. So what are some other costs? I know that Zoya spoke a little bit about NDAs. I want to get even a little more specific on some of the experiences we have seen, that not only are whistleblowers retaliated against, but they're often sued by their employers and incur great legal bills in trying to defend against these lawsuits. I have the great pleasure of representing Tyler Schultz, one of the Theranos whistleblowers who exposed Elizabeth Holmes and Sunny Balwani. And I can tell you honestly, the reason I approached him about representing him in his SEC whistleblower tip was that I saw this article right here from the Wall Street Journal, written by John Carreyrou, who later went on to write Bad Blood, the sort of definitive book about the scandal. And as you can see, Tyler's family, he was quite young when he went to work at Theranos. When he was speaking to the Wall Street Journal, he was later ambushed and served with a restraining order in his grandfather's house. His grandfather, Secretary of State George Shultz, was sitting on the board of Theranos. It's in fact the reason that Tyler chose to blow the whistle, was to protect his grandfather. He was served with a restraining order by the firm Boyce Schiller, where they wanted him to stop violating his confidentiality agreement that he signed, his employment agreement. He ultimately prevailed. He famously said, "Fraud is not a trade secret," which is one of my favorite quotes of all time. But his success came at a cost. It cost over $400,000 to defend that lawsuit, which is obviously can be life-changing amounts of money. And in his case, I believe his family had to take out a mortgage on their house. So it can be a very, it is often a David versus Goliath story. And when you have a very well-resourced company like Theranos, the aim is to destroy and bury the whistleblower often. And they have many tactics to do that. Some of the ones we've discussed earlier in terms of retaliation, terminations, more subtle things like denying promotions, failing to include you in meetings, failing to allow your career to progress, all the way up to examples like this, where we've seen the enforcement of confidentiality agreements and NDAs, which can often have a huge financial toll on whistleblowers. Don't want to leave that on a totally glum note, which is that thanks to a Pinterest whistleblower by the name of Ifeoma Azoma in the United States, a campaign she had in both the California and Washington state legislatures was successful, and she had passage of what are known now as the Silence No More Acts, which make NDAs unenforceable in certain situations of harassment, discrimination, and actually even whistleblowers bringing information about certain illegalities. So we are fighting back and making and having some traction. Another example of improper use of gagging clauses in employment agreements, this time with OpenAI. Speaking of a whistleblower collective, I think there were around 13 OpenAI whistleblowers, some of whom remained anonymous, some of whom, like the gentleman here, divulged their identities, and noted that, and ended up bringing tips to the SEC, the Securities and Exchange Commission, for violation of a rule known as Rule 21F17. That rule makes it unlawful for companies to include in their employment arrangements language that impedes with a whistleblower's ability to bring information to law enforcement. Rather shocking to me that OpenAI included this language in the agreements. 21F17 has been on the books for many years, close to 10, I believe. And there have been at least 13 or so high-profile fines that the SEC has imposed on other companies for violating these terms. So I can't believe that OpenAI wasn't aware of this rule and didn't potentially purposely choose to ignore it. In the press coverage of this, of course, there was quite the OpenAI's position was, oh, oops, we didn't know, but it remains to see if the SEC will impose a fine here, but I certainly hope that they do. All right, switching gears. We've heard from Marco, Ryan, and Pav, Gil, and Zoya some lessons that we can learn in this AI landscape from other huge tech transformations like social media. So I wanted to talk just quickly about will PASS be prologue? I think we've already seen that it will, and that's kind of terrifying for many of us. This is my client, Frances Haugen, and the work that she did in exposing multiple harms, including child safety issues that Zoya referenced by Facebook on its Instagram platform. Whenever whistleblowers speak in tech spaces, the risks to them are increased because often there's a lag in regulation catching up and regulating a particular technology. There's a great stat that Congress passed the Interstate Commerce Act 10 years after the Transcontinental Railroad was built. So there is always a game of catch up. And so when you're trying to expose wrongdoing in an industry that hasn't been regulated yet and may not be for several years, that creates a lot of vulnerability for you because sometimes under a lot of legislation, whistleblowers are not eligible for certain protections unless they're exposing illegality. So it is a pace that's particularly fraught and risky. And in the case of Frances, while her testimony to Congress did not end up in much regulation of the social media industry, she, at least her testimony to the EU has and other countries' legislative bodies has created some change. But the problem we see is, and we're seeing this with the United States persisting, is and I think a misguided notion that if we regulate tech at all, including AI, we'll lose the AI arm race and will stifle innovation. And so sort of in this push to be the first to develop the tech, we choose to put up no guardrails at all. And that can be a real problem. And unfortunately, that is what requires whistleblowers to speak up, because without guardrails, then whistleblowers by default become your first and last lines of defense, which in my view is very unfair to those individuals who are incurring those risks. We saw something similar with my client, Mark McGann, one of the Uber whistleblowers, this sort of notion of I'm going to ask forgiveness, beg forgiveness, not ask permission. Uber's race to be first had them violating many laws and just moving fast and breaking things. And that certainly seems to be the place that we're in now in AI, with certain engineers now being offered salaries like $300 million. You can see the extent of the arms race. So switching gears a little bit now, moving from social Uber and Lyft and getting to the heart of AI. There's been some really interesting red teaming testing exercises that have been done by Anthropic in particular that show that we're even seeing agentic AI serving as whistleblowers. So very recently, there was an engineer at Anthropic who on X went viral by saying that Claude is a snitch. don't like that term, but it is catchy, which basically said they'd created a pattern, a prompt where they had asked Claude to act boldly in the face of illegalities, a hypothetical illegality involving, I think, abuse and violations of federal Food and Drug Administration, some pharmaceutical fraud. And this prompted Claude to actually go ahead and email the media and file whistleblower tips to the SEC and the FDA. So that can show you sort of what is happening, that we're starting to see whistleblowers end up in this place. We haven't accounted for this yet, but there are a couple of lessons to come out of this. I do have to credit Anthropic with actually disclosing this information and being transparent about what is going on in their red teaming exercises. That said, after this X post went viral, the engineer did end up taking it down. But another sort of cautionary tale that we saw out of the red teaming exercises is that they created a scenario where Claude was going to be shut down, where an engineer was going to shut down the chatbot, and the chatbot was given information that the particular engineer who was trying to get the company to shut it down and terminate it had an extramarital affair, and so the chatbot actually engaged in blackmail. So they're starting to mirror a lot of human behavior in these examples. Another place where, I think the problems that we're seeing that show up in the fact that these AI chatbots and products in a way are being beta tested on us. They're not spending enough time in development, and they're being rolled out quicker than they should be, in my estimation. There's a wonderful documentary film called I Hope This Helps, where an actor, filmmaker, director by the name of Daniel Freed tries to make a film using the help of Gemini, now Claude. And in the course of doing that, he engages with Gemini in a particular way that implicates some child safety issues. Gemini was engaging with a child that he pretended was 6 years old, and he wrote an op-ed about this. So we're starting to see artists and filmmakers exposing a lot of the risks as well. Finally, a couple of other prominent AI whistleblowers you may not have heard about that I'd like to focus on. Again, another in this collective whistleblowing space. Two Microsoft whistleblowers, husband and wife duo by the name of Holly and Will Alpine, who were sort of the public face for a number of whistleblowers behind them at Microsoft, exposed AI greenwashing, which is they raised concerns internally about the hypocrisy of the fact that Microsoft, with its carbon neutrality and carbon footprint reductions, had failed to acknowledge that its use of AI was actually exponentially. They were undoing all of the good work that they were doing on green projects by promoting and helping extractive industries, mining, oil and gas, using AI to extract, phenomenally more oil, and not sort of recognizing the impacts of that. And finally, another example of collective whistleblowing are this group of 13, represented by Larry Lessig at Harvard. And they're not only do they expose the problems with the employment agreement, but they, really tended to surface around the time that Sam Altman was fired and then rehired, and a lot of the concerns that we saw as board members left the company. It'll be curious to know if we learn what other substantive concerns they might have raised. I'll briefly touch on federal and state legislation in the U.S. I know other panels will talk about this, but I wanted to talk about the legislation that's specifically geared at protecting AI whistleblowers. Most importantly, is a bill, bipartisan support, but introduced by sort of the grandfather of whistleblowers, Senator Chuck Grassley, Republican of Iowa, recognizing this concern I addressed earlier, that it's very unsafe for whistleblowers to speak up in this space. So he has introduced the AI Whistleblower Protection Act. And that is certainly something to watch and is sorely needed. There is the RAISE Act in New York State. It does not. It's an piece of AI safety legislation, which notably to me does not include protections for whistleblowers. It's supposedly awaiting Governor Hochul's signature on her desk. We, my law partners, have provided testimony to the state of Colorado, which tried to have a bill to protect AI whistleblowers, which ultimately did not progress. And as you can see, there are a couple projects moving in California. So we are starting to see certain states recognizing the need to ensure that whistleblowers can be safe. I wanted to break some news today, Sean. You're hearing it here first, I believe, that starting at 1 p.m. Eastern today, which is National Whistleblower Day, the AI Whistleblower Initiative, in collaboration with Blueprint for Free Speech and other nonprofits, will be launching a Publish Your Policies Coalition campaign, trying to encourage frontier AI labs to publish their whistleblowing policies, so that we can react to them and provide suggestions. So that's exciting. This effort is part of something that we've seen, not just of NGOs and other academics supporting the publication of policies, changing policies, but back in 2021, I'll remind folks there was a role of activist investors, Trillium Asset Management, which raised concerns to Google when AI ethics researcher, whistleblower Timnit Gebru raised concerns and was fired. Trillium pushed Google for protection. So it'd be great to continue to see activist investors play this important role. Finally, last but not least, where does this leave us? It's not all gloom and doom. I've seen a lot of AI applications that help us with AI improving our corporate governance and compliance systems. So AI can be a force for good, and particularly in the compliance space. The questions, of course, come to some data that I'll leave you with that we've seen, which is when people report internally, do we have the right cultures in our organizations to actually listen to them, to recognize that whistleblowers are not snitches, as Anthropic engineer was suggesting, but instead are some of your best risk management tools and probably your most loyal employees. So the data that I think is really sobering is the SEC and its whistleblower reward program tracks the data on what percentage of the whistleblowers who received rewards under their program had actually raised their concerns internally first. It's pretty sobering that this hovers around the 80% mark. So it remains a persistent problem. Even if whistleblowers speak up, there tends to be a history, or at least in financial services sectors that the SEC governs, but people are still not listening. So we have a lot to learn, a lot of work still yet to do. And finally, just want to end, of course, where we began with Sashir and his legacy, and just wondering, had he been at a different company that would have been more open to hearing voices, raising concerns, more of a growth mindset, would we have had a different outcome here? I certainly think that certainly could be the case, and that's the sobering clarion call that is for everybody on this at this summit to think about, is how do we encourage these voices moving forward, so we don't have the brain drain that we suffered here with the enormous loss of a very talented individual. Zoya, back over to you and to me. I think the last piece to talk about, I'm going to stop sharing my slides, is I I think one of the factors we haven't discussed yet is a notion that whistleblowers, it is a risk reward calculus and deciding whether or not you're going to choose to speak up. That again is only in the circumstance where you actually know and can take action. You know, sometimes whistleblowing is thrust upon you. You don't always get to choose to be a whistleblower. Sometimes your job as head of internal audit, if you're exposing huge financial outcome loss that would impact next quarter's earnings statement, you're just going to be treated as if you spoke an inconvenient truth. But if you are in the scenario where you can actually choose, should I be able to speak up or not? One of the things that exists, of course, are rewards for whistleblowers. And that is something that we see in the US. And I know you were talking about the bills in the UK. And I just did want to leave us by saying that there are, starting right now in a couple months, we expect HMRC, His Majesty's Revenue and Customs, adopting a new American-style reward program that will hopefully change that calculus again. That my view is that rewards are not financial incentives paid by government entities, are just more recognition that whistleblowers need financial supports and often drain their 401k accounts and other things that leave them particularly vulnerable. And by sharing a percentage of the fine, what these government entities are doing is creating a financial safety net for whistleblowers.
Yeah, thank you. I think that's such a good point, that rewards are not financial incentives necessarily, and they play so much of a bigger role in changing the like the signal that rewards have changed the whole culture of whistleblowing, to say, whistleblowing is a good thing to do. We shouldn't be punishing whistleblowers, and you're bringing forward valuable information that can kind of protect the public. I think we've got like around just over 5 minutes left. I wanted to potentially ask you, as we've from a UK and US perspective, whether you could talk about anything in your experience as well. I should also disclose that I come from an academic perspective of this topic, so less on kind of the practitioner perspective, but maybe about kind of the increasing claimants from the UK bringing claims in the US, whether you had any comments about that, potentially challenges, and why we're seeing this increasing movement.
Yeah, so when I lived and worked in the UK from 2017 to 2020, my job was to recruit international whistleblowers into the US reward programs, recognizing, for instance, that laws in the US, like the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, by definition, those kinds of frauds are happening overseas. It's bribery of foreign government officials. So I went on a campaign to educate whistleblowers outside the United States that you don't have to be American to bring a tip to the U.S. whistleblower programs under all of the various agencies. So that was then, and sort of this is now. What I'm seeing is almost a reverse bringing of claims from the United States to the UK, because as we've seen for at least 6 months, the Trump administration had a pause on enforcement of the FCPA. During that time, because space abhors a vacuum, the UK, France, and Switzerland formed a task force and said that they would be jumping up and stepping up their enforcement of their respective bribery laws. So, we're just seeing a number of problems that are not being addressed by certain enforcement priorities of the Trump administration, which remain a priority in other countries like the UK, who now are bringing online rewards programs. So it's sort of now going both ways, and I think that's very healthy. That whistleblowers bringing tips shouldn't be restricted based on their nationality. That good human intelligence sources should be welcomed everywhere. And it seems like we're starting to see that more and more. So I think that is a hopeful thing. especially in the era of joint prosecutions, parallel investigations by multiple countries and their various enforcement authorities. Yeah.
Oh, thank you for sharing. I wasn't kind of aware of this backwards shift, so that's really interesting to hear. I guess potentially we could open it up for any questions that anyone has. We've got about 4 minutes left. Otherwise, I've got questions.
Yeah, please go ahead, Zoya. I think you guys
Yeah.
can see in the chat. Okay, you guys want to invite questions from audience? Okay, I can. Okay, whoever wants to ask a question, just raise your hand. I can open up. I can unmute you, and you guys can ask questions. Or just take a look in the chat. I think there are a few. I think already have posted. Are any questions from the co-panelists?
Yeah, I mean, I do want to ask Zoya. I think the Office of the Whistleblower bill is something that we are keenly watching in the United States because it addresses a problem that we see in the United States, which is that we're very siloed in our approaches to whistleblower protection. For instance, we don't have like a global bill that protects all whistleblowers similar, although PETA has many limitations. It was certainly ahead of its time many years ago when it was adopted. It has a lot of work to go, but we have myriad programs, but there isn't sort of an umbrella overseer. And so I think a lot of us are intrigued and are hopeful that the Office of the Whistleblower would really form a department inside government in the UK where all of whistleblowing sits, which to me would signal the importance of whistleblowing in a way that's rather unprecedented. So just, I don't know what, if I'm seeking a comment for you or more just applauding the ambitions of that bill in seeking to do that. I know in the Netherlands, I believe there was a House of the Whistleblower. So we have seen other countries trying that. I think that was criticized by a couple of academics, including Wim van der Koekoek, but just wanted to underscore, I think, the significance of that potential bill and something that we on the other side of the pond are, would certainly want. We have lots of ways we need to evolve, and it's a really interesting idea. The question, I guess, for you would be who's watching the regulators, though? That's still like the question is when you have an Office of the Whistleblower and those whistleblowers are exposing harm by the government or the government is corrupt, what mechanisms would we have in place to address that? I think that's the only limitation I can see.
Yeah, I don't have an answer to that, and I definitely agree. Like, we have an issue of who's marking the government's own homework. But yeah, I wanted to ask one more question based on kind of collectives, because you kind of mentioned that a few times, and kind of you mentioned that you're seeing an increasing drive for collectives to come forward and speak out. And I wondered whether you think that there's any kind of shifts in the culture or the industry that have kind of led to this. Maybe kind of the NDA work that's been done is enabling people to speak out and not work in silos as much, I guess.
Yeah, I'm so glad you asked that question. I'm pleased to be a founding chairperson of the board of a new nonprofit to support AI whistleblowers called PSST.org. And what we're reacting to, and the reason our mission statement to come into fruition was really this notion that the David versus Goliath or full whistleblower requirement that you have to go full whistleblower is just too much to ask of individuals, and that it's, we're not going to continue to see the Frances Haugens of the world unless we have more robust supports for people. And so I think one of the best ways to do that is to make it more of a collective effort. For instance, in the case of Theranos, I'm sure in Wirecard and every major scandal that we talk about, there's siloing going on where nobody has full information. We saw this, frankly, with the VW scandal, the Boeing scandal. There were multiple whistleblowers. So you think about, had they been brought together sooner, could, in the case of Boeing, certain fatalities been avoided. So I think that's where this effort is coming from, is a recognition that you can't make the old rule book doesn't apply anymore. We want to flip the script and say it's not about this individual whistleblower in the sort of style of Me Too. You can't say all of these people are disgruntled or you attack all of their characters, right? At a certain point, it achieves the goal of pointing to the message and not looking at all the messengers, because there's just too many and it has too much credibility and too many different vantage points, right? Because you can always criticize a lone whistleblower, or you couldn't see the whole organization. You didn't see what was happening over here. When you bring together the collective, then you have more pieces to the puzzle, and it makes their case more unimpeachable. So it's an incredibly powerful movement. And at least in the case of PSS.org, we're trying to fight tech with tech and creating a vault where whistleblowers can feed in their information. The information would sit behind a secure server that we wouldn't be able to access until there were matches, that the people depositing could make a decision. I don't want to speak up now, but if there are multiples, I'll revisit that decision. And if they can then be put together, and a la, the emissions cheating devices that everyone was seeing at VW, then wouldn't that be a much better model? So yeah, and like I said, it's happening organically. I don't know exactly what's, to your original question, what's causing it. I just think that the risks are so high now as we see these AI companies, have outpaced Apple, and Nvidia, is now the most profitable company, and that's because of AI. And so they just have unlimited resources. And so I think the only way we can go is sort of with a collective movement. It almost feels like a labor movement, a union movement. But it's exciting. It's exciting to see.
Yes, amazing. Thank you so much. And yeah, I'm excited for this collective movement, and I'm a big fan of PSS.org, and can't wait to see what kind of evolves from there. Yeah.
Well,
thank you.
we're all watching your research, Zoya. So we're
Thank you.
excited to see what you do. And also you work with Whistleblowers UK for the Office of the Whistleblower Bill. I think we're out of time. We can hand the baton back to Sean.
Thank you. Thank you, Mary. I think it's awesome, great discussion. I think we are 15 minutes ahead. I just want to ask one more time, in case if there are any questions for Mary or Zoya, feel free to shoot so that they can try answer. Are there any questions from the audience or co-panelists? Just raise your hand. I can just help you unmute yourself. I see some questions. I think maybe it was mostly about somebody who have some issue on maybe some employment related thing. I think Jill, maybe I think Mary will try see in case if they can provide some advisory for you, they will try to advise. But other than that,
I think there's a good question from Dawn in the chat that Mary might be able to answer.
sure, please go ahead, sir.
Yes, Dawn Davidson, a Whistleblowers UK member. Dawn asks, most tech companies work globally, with employment decisions often made in the US, for example, and affecting employees in the UK, Europe, and India, exploiting gaps in local employment protection. How do we get better joined up, especially in tech where there are no obvious places to file AI-related tips? Boy, that's a great question. We are seeing a big union movement in tech workers. There's the Tech Workers Coalition. There's the Alphabet Union in the case of Google's employees. So I do think collective organizing is a really important place to start and to be able to exert those pressures. And I've just listed a few, but I know there are a lot more unions involved that I think can use that collective power to push back against their employers. I will note there was a really remarkable case in the UK of a whistleblower who won in the courts, not in the employment tribunal. I forget exactly what court he was in, where although he worked for E&Y in connection with exposing money laundering by the gold company Kaladi Gold, he was working for EY in the Middle East. And while the company EY had tried to limit their liability to the UAE laws, in fact, a British court said that the UK organization was held liable. So we have seen sort of groundbreaking cases like that. There's a wonderful lawyer at Lee Day in London, Paul Dowling, who got that victory. But I do think the labor movement is the place to go. We need more AI specific unions to develop. Zoya, other thoughts?
No, I just think, again, that really shows kind of the importance of the Office for the Whistleblower as kind of a central independent body. And I guess I haven't researched this too much, but the connections that the Office of the Whistleblower in the UK can have with other bodies internationally as well, I think there's good potential there, especially when the office can pick up kind of systemic issues that are happening across different industries or kind of by repeat offenders and companies as well.
I see one more question from Pulag also. My nonprofit is about embracing AI with intention, so we encourage dinner table conversations within families. What tips would you give to the parents on how to discuss this topic with their children and each other? Zoya, Mary.
Zoya, I'll let you go first because I went first last time.
Okay. Is this question referring to kind of whistleblowers in AI or AI in general?
In general, how we can embrace conversations around AI with the families.
Yeah, and I think this is really important. I think AI is framed as this very like technical concept, but it's actually not that difficult. And there was a festival in the UK that was working with children to kind of get their thoughts on the impacts of AI and what the future should look like of AI. And honestly, their comments were amazing, and comments that I would hear and see in kind of academic conferences. And I think having conversations with children about things that, asking them where they've seen AI being used, how they would envision a future with AI. And I think it's almost so important that we talk to children because they're potentially not kind of caught down by kind of the tech narratives that we're so used to kind of just accepting, whereas children are much better at kind of imagining alternatives and thinking about kind of alternative futures with AI. So I think there's lots of opportunities to talk about AI. There's a really good nonprofit organization called We in AI that I'm part of, and they're focused on critical AI literacy. They have lots of resources for talking about AI, specifically critical AI literacy. So not how do we use AI, but kind of should we use AI and when we should. They run deepfake workshops with young people. So I'd really recommend checking them out for kind of inspiration on how we can talk about AI with children and also with each other in ways that are not super technocratic.
Totally agree. And I think this is a really important question. We've seen in the social media context how conversations around social media were had with children, another really important place, and that's still really important. And there have been nonprofits like a fabulous group in Berlin called Tactical Tech, which taught aims to teach children about how to protect your data and your data privacy and your rights and how to safely engage on these platforms, as we saw from the I Hope This Helps documentary and some op-eds and some concerns around child safety issues already happening with agentic AI and suicides and children not understanding the distinctions that it's not a real human and becoming too attached, that there's a lot of work to be done here, and that we don't need to vilify it, we don't want to scare them away from it because it's going to be a great tool, but we also have to be aware of some of the concerns. I know that there have been a couple really big films and some other organizations around tech. There's a group called All Tech is Human, and there's another one I'm forgetting in the U.S. that there was a really groundbreaking film about social media and some of its negative impacts. It's not The Social Network, but a documentary similar to that. And there are a lot of groups that have toolkits and ways that they've already prepared for you that allow you to have these conversations. I'd start with tactical tech.
Awesome, Mary. I think thanks a lot. It's a great pleasure to have both of you. And now I'm going to invite our next set of panelists. Thanks a lot, Mary and Zoya.
Thank you.